welcome to folks joining via the recording, should I ever get around to posting them. We are going on to a couple of modeling topics and then discussion around API next steps. The first, and I'll share my screen. Share to make sure that it is not quite such a tedious. Here we go. Video. Okay, so the first topic is links to external authorities. Issue 307, opened by Thanasis earlier this year. So the issue here is that at the moment we use SCOS exact match to link resources together that are very likely to be able to be used in place of each other. So ULAN 500123456 is an exact match with the local instance of whoever that person is. Thanasis brings up that in CRM, there is a correlation between SCOS concept and the CRM's type class, which is just a concept. And because we use it to refer to people, we would be thus saying that this person, this real world physical person, is a conceptual thing, and that is not even close to being semantically valid. So the discussion went on for a bit as to various options, and no one really came up with anything particularly reasonable or particularly satisfying, I should say. So the issue really is, just to scroll through some of the options, that while exact match is used for concepts, we have sort of currently misappropriated the term to use it to say that this person is an exact match for that person, and we're really talking about the identifier space rather than about the physical space at that point. Because we don't want to use our same as, because that leads and gets us into all sorts of stickiness, where people associate more, metadata about essentially the record with the entity rather than only properties of the object of the entity. So for example, if you say there is a license CC BY, say, on this data, then and you put that on your copy of the person, and then someone says, well, ULAN is our same as that person, ULAN 12356, then our ULAN 123456 gets your license associated with it, quite apart from the fact that people can't have licenses, but that does happen a lot. So then our same as is too strong. There is a CRM equivalent of L54 is same as that would work, but has the same issues, of course. And it's part of an extension which needs some work on it. So it could be farmed out to a very verbose pattern of attribute assignments to say and this gets into all sorts of weirdness. It is probably the case, and hopefully people can see what I'm highlighting in the share. It's probably the case that person X is the same as ULAN person. That's not very satisfying because it takes a lot of machinery just to do the same as exact match ULAN person. We could create a new relationship, which would be practically the same as exact match, but with a different range and domain. then Thanasis said, well, can't we do this? That person is identified by ULAN 27372, and that this thing is an identifier, which not really in this case, because this identity is for a person, not for an identifier of a person. In order to try to derive what the desirable features of the solution are, I think the important ones are we should have the URI directly in the model as a URI rather than as a string. So the way to avoid this issue is to not have this in the ID field, but to have it as content of the identifier. But then the URI is a string and not a URI. So then you can't, you wouldn't be treating it any differently from 95.108 as an accession number or similar, where clearly you're not going to try to dereference 95.108. So equally, there's these two cases for having the URI in the model. We can have it directly in the model. The production is carried out by Rembrandt, where Rembrandt clearly is thus a person. Or we have a local person instance, and we want to say that this person instance is effectively the same as the remote person instance, so VF Rembrandt or ULAN, Lewis Carroll or whoever. And further, I think that these two patterns should both be similar if at all possible. E.g., having one as a string and one as a URI seems odd. So the desirable features then, from my perspective, it should be consistent semantically. You know, an entity is not a person and an identifier at the same time. That's to me worse than overloading or ignoring the range and domain of a property, because then the additional typing is available through, is asserted only through inferencing, e.g. based on the domain and range, rather than directly in the data. The URI should be a resource rather than a string so that you can activate it. Hopefully we can use existing ontological features for classes and properties rather than having to invent new terms, and it should be meaningful, you know, e.g. it respects the meaning of the properties. Then the possible solutions, the semantically rigorous one is the attribute assignment one of asserting same as, but it's a huge overhead just for something that I expect to happen quite a lot. We could use exact match and ignore the range and domain implications because it's easy and it only loses the last of the four patterns and keeps the top three. We could use our same as, which is meaningful, but the implications are horrible. We can find another term that has the same semantics, but I don't know of one. So this is a call for people to say if they do know one. Or we could invent a new term that's an equivalent, but in the linked art namespace, and has a different range and domain, probably of E1 entity. So in linked art. And that would then not use existing features, but be creating a new one in order to keep the bottom bullet. Richard Light commented 10 minutes ago, which I clearly haven't had a chance to read. But before looking at that, Antoine, as a person who is very deeply involved in SCOS, what are your thoughts on this conundrum?
Yeah, it's horrible, isn't it? Actually, I think Richard has been involved in some of these discussions years ago. I guess Well, I think I would prefer to use Cosset exact match because it's way simpler. But maybe we should also ask ourselves what we want, what kind of resource we want to use in that position in the graph. I mean, there are concepts and there are real world persons.
Yeah.
Do we want to make the distinction and to enforce this distinction in this position in the pattern?
Yeah, I think the pattern in terms of sort of API and ease of understanding that we want to be aiming for is something like this, where there is a person that we have, e.g. it's the artist who carried out the production of an object, or the buyer of an object, and hence the transferred title to person. And then we want to say that this person who we know something about locally, their name or their address or whatever, or that we want to assert something locally about, is the same, in inverted commas, the same for all intents and purposes of information systems, if not the same for absolutely every single property in this remote system, so that then a consuming application that sees this exact match can dereference the external URI and see if it can process what information is there and add it into the graph to enrich the experience.
Yeah, but I think my question is actually even before that.
Sure.
It is what can count as something of type person. So really the very first two lines of your example. So if the creator of an object is, this resource, which is local IRE of person of type person, then is this expected not to be a concept? And I'm going to phrase it differently. Imagine your R Getty, and the local URI of the person is the ULAN URI. So will you stick the ULAN URI as the ID of that resource of type person?
If we were, yes. So we have done the mapping, because it's not hard, of ULAN to Linked Art, and it's implemented, it's just not public yet. I still need to find out from David when that's going to go live. But the reason I know that that exists is it is the backing for our Open Refine reconciliation services. So instead of going directly to the database, we go to the Linked Art model for people, concepts, and places to do the Open Refine API for the vocabs, meaning that that code could then be applied to any other system that exposes Linked Art, which is cool, I think. But so if thus this was ULAN 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and we wanted to say it's the same as VF Rembrandt or LCNAF Rembrandt or something, then this would be a person in ULAN. And we have observed the use of ULAN and TGN, and practically no one reads Vlad's documentation. They just look up on the web what the number is and put that into the data. So there are vastly many links from people to what is currently a concept, but in the Linked Art view will be a real person rather than the concept of a person.
So, but even so, again, so thanks. I think that clarifies, but I need to double check because of what you said in the end. So there are links between persons and concepts, yes, but also there will be links between objects and concepts that will parade as persons.
Ah, yes. Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
So, and as soon as we have that, and we are ready to have this also applied in, well, for other local authorities. I mean, for example, the Rijksmuseum may have their authorities represented as concepts or another museum, and they would stick the URI of these concepts in the creator field, and they would therefore appear as resources of type person in the linked art description for the object.
Mm-hmm.
And that means that we are already sort of breaking this assumption that person should not be concepts.
Yep. Yep.
So that's the fundamental issue. And as soon as we say that we are comfortable with this, then we can use exact match, because it's actually a very small issue compared to the very fundamental one that we said we were comfortable with.
Yep. Yep. I agree completely. And indeed, the value of linking up identifiers for the same entity, regardless of the exact semantics of the external resource, the external description, external entity, seems to vastly outweigh any nonsense inferencing based on domain and range around the by applying all of the semantics across both of them to say that it's and this is why it really can't be same as, right? That it's not both a person and a concept, and we want to make sure that that doesn't get asserted. The only thing that we would be really inferring is that the local person is also a concept. And if you just ignore that particular inference, then everything seems to work. So given that we also can't control what the external resource description is, we will end up aligning people with concepts, we'll end up aligning groups with the things that we think of as a group with things that other people might think of as a person, and so on and so forth. Or roles in the archival ontology is a type of person, which I find odd, whereas in CRM it's a type of group, and in other ontologies they're just roles as a contextualization of an activity. So, and hence sort of more conceptual rather than an actor. We are going to end up in this situation regardless. So tearing our hair out about the exact details to me seems not worth the effort.
So in terms of where that effort sits, I guess there's a question of if we were to take the semantic inferencing problem seriously, then what would be the cost of mitigation if one wanted to do it? I.e., could one programmatically fix that? Is it sufficiently consistent that we could do as you're suggesting by default, but if anyone cared enough, they would be able to unpick it to make it semantically consistent?
Yeah. So there is there's the long form that is consistent, which is someone says that it's probably the case that local and remote are the same thing. And then there's the short form of exact match. So I would imagine that a clever system with OWL property chains and other cleverness could say every time you see exact match URI, instead substitute that,
Right.
and you'll be saying the same thing, just this is the rigorous version and this is the shortcut version.
Right. I mean, that seems plausible to me. I guess it's, yeah. Are you confident on that? I'm sort of looking at this fresh, and yeah, I mean, I that seems convincing to me. But because if so, that really does mitigate the problem, right? If one can substitute through, then there is some cake and you can eat it.
Yep. I guess the question is twofold. One, can you actually express this as a OWL inference rule? And I'm not sure about that. I haven't tried it. And secondly, even if you did express that, would it avoid the actual problem, which is the other inference from just the domain and range of exact match, that both of these things are SCOS concepts? And that I also don't know. Yeah,
I mean, I think there's an element of kicking the can down a different part of the road, but it depends on where you want your consistency.
Yes, yeah. Antoine or anyone else, does someone know, or does someone have a better intuition than Kevin or I about the possibility of that? Like, we can ask experts.
For what exactly?
If we set up, so say you've got a triple store, blaze graph or whatever underneath, and inferencing is turned on, could you set up an inference chain that said, when you see exact match you learn person, assume that, infer that there is such an attribute assignment that is probable and assigns same as between the person and the remote person?
Yeah, that's inferring the existence of a blank node.
Yeah.
Actually, I think I've attempted those things several years ago. I think it is possible by defining some specific classes, like the class of things with the attribute that you want to use, and say that there exists an instance of this class which is connected to the object by another attribute.
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, I will reach out to to Vlad. So we have a sort of ongoing contract with them, and if anyone knows about inferencing and setting up this sort of thing and the SCOS and CRM interactions, it would be Vlad. So
yeah,
I'll see if he has any thoughts on it.
Well, honestly, I can review if he comes with something, but in the coming, I mean, I would say if you would expect an answer for the end of March, I could commit to it, but not in the coming 2 weeks.
Yep, no, that's fine.
But if Vladimir comes with something, then I would happily review it, because that's not the same level of effort. Because I've been involved in these discussions, but that's a long time ago.
Yep. Anyone else with thoughts about this in terms of? Sorry, I'll go back to the easier to look at examples. So yeah, are there any concerns about just continuing to use exact match and then exploring whether there is an automatable way of setting up a rule that matches up with this pattern. Or does anyone have any suggestions that we haven't considered so far? Nope. So I think we are thus. Well, is anyone not okay with what we have proposed, which is to continue to use exact match and explore inferencing, because that's where the challenge is, rather than anywhere else. So we can see if we can resolve it in that space. Nope. Okay, good. So on to the next one. So the next one is a long outstanding one, and a sort of fundamental one, of 186.
Rob, this might be a good point for me to hand off the notes, so it's down in the middle of it.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. And would someone else be willing to take up the note taking?
I'll go.
Perfect. Thank you, Richard. So 186 is essentially the observation that we use vocabularies an awful lot in CRM and thus in Linked Art as proxy for ontological classes when such a class is simply unnecessary as a for inferencing and so on. So in other ontologies like BibFrame or Rico, the archives ontology, and many others, there are very specific classes such as painting or book. In Linked Art, we put them over to vocabularies, but it does mean that we need to be careful about which vocabulary entries we require, which we recommend, and where we can safely remain silent and just let people do whatever. And of course, there's no absolute way of enforcing any of this. If someone decided to use a different vocabulary where we wanted them to use a particular term, it would probably put any Linked Art specific processor into an error state, because it wouldn't know what to do, because it was expecting something that we would otherwise be requiring. But at the end of the day, the change to fix that would not be complicated. You would just simply check for both. So it reduces interoperability to not follow it, but it's not a terrible situation if it's not followed. So what we decided to do was to form essentially a subgroup, and subgroup has not been as active, and I take full responsibility for not pushing it. So to look at this, so we made a spreadsheet, and we commented on various things. I went through all the docs and so on, and pulled out all of the different classes. Different classes and the different types of classification that we associate with them. But we didn't have a methodology, I guess, for determining which ones should be required or recommended or simply noted or just remain silent about them completely. So I think the useful thing to do for the rest of this call would be to discuss what those what that rubric would be for how to determine which falls into which category, and then we can go away and apply that rubric with more confidence, rather that that it'll meet the expectations of the overall group once that's been done. So a set of suggestions for what that rubric might look like. Required terms. So these are ones where we would say, if you are doing linked art, then you must use these terms. There's no choice about it. And hence we should be reasonably sparing with them. But there are times when we have to do this. I think they are metatypes. So if we continue to agree that things like the type of object, we shouldn't be mandating a list of all of the different types of objects that museums have, because there are far too many of them, and we'd just be duplicating existing work of the different vocabularies. But in order to know that the classification, the type of the object is a type of object without recognizing explicitly all of the types of object, then the metatype needs to be required. So that is about 5 or 6 things. So the obvious one being type of object. There's also things like type of work, and then some person ones of nationality, ethnicity, profession, and gender. And yes, if you don't understand the metatype, you won't be able to do anything with the type that it is typing, and those types are equally critical to be able to at least present to a user, if not also do inferencing on. So that's the first one I think has to be required. Replacements for ontology. So things like primary name, or title, that otherwise would be part of the ontology, either as a class or as a property. We need to require them because we are not requiring the ontology to be fixed, to be set required. So I think primary name is an easy one. If you don't understand primary name, then you'll have a significant challenge building any sort of consuming system for the data. And this is a bit squishier than metatypes, right? It's not just there's a bit of subjectivity about what is a replacement for ontology and what is just part of the graph. Any trivially enumerable sets. So if we can list out all of the possibilities and no one is going to suggest, oh, but what about X? Then I think we should just go ahead and do that. The types of dimension might be one, e.g. height, width, depth, weight, and so on. But equally, there could be other dimensions types of dimension that we don't know about. Conversely, the unit of the dimension seems like that is not trivially enumerable, even if it is possibly enumerable, because everyone will have yet another measuring standard that they use for a particular object. And then API distinguishing terms. So if there are, and this of course needs to fold in with the API work, but if there is a vocabulary entry that would distinguish between 2 different API representations, or responses rather, then they would need to be required so that a consuming client knows which of the 2 APIs they're interacting with. So for example, if there was an exhibition activity and a provenance activity, those are would be different API responses because the models are very different. But at the ontology layer, they're both just activities. So thus we should require terms to distinguish them so that a client can be certain of how to process the rest of the response. Then terms that we could recommend are enumerable sets. So the parts of personal names, maybe we could recommend them, but there's frequently going to be or units of dimensions. You shouldn't have to dig around for first name. You shouldn't have to dig around for centimeters or seconds. We can just recommend here, use this, and everyone will know what you're talking about. And equally, ultra common terms. There are very few museums that do not have a painting or a drawing or a sculpture. There's doubtless many museums that do not have a suit of armor or a clock or a playing card. So having to dig around for painting seems like we're just wasting people's time, even if we're not saying you have to use AAT painting, but at least we've given them the easy route towards consistency, rather than hoping that they eventually do end up consistent. And probably, I would say, if we don't recommend things like that, people will just put in local URIs, and we've lost an easy interoperability point. So then other things we could simply list, which would be presented quite separately to avoid the implication that they're recommended. But if terms keep coming up, then we could simply put them in a big bucket, so that you can look through and say, okay, yeah, I need this one, and this one, rather than having to go to AAT or LCSH or wherever to find the terms by yourself. So terms that come up frequently, but they're not ultra common. If several organizations have it, but not every organization, we could list it. If it's only one institution, probably we don't even list it. So, thoughts on this? Is this a reasonable way forwards? Should we move some of these around, or what? Sammy and Bree and Dave, particularly, I guess, since you've been involved in the vocabulary discussions a little bit more, does this seem like a reasonable way forwards, or?
I think I was muted. Sorry. Yeah. I think this seems reasonable, at least to get started.
Mm-hmm. And Sammy or Bree, any thoughts? Sammy is having mic issues and thinks it's reasonable, and Karina is muted. At first glance, that sounds good. Okay, so that seems like we should try it and see what happens, and maybe we'll iterate on the rubric as we try to apply it. What's required? Object type. So for the Karina, you mean for this one? Oh, I see. The spreadsheet's assignable. So yeah, and this was, I think, one of the areas where I really ran into the need for the rubric, that in the spreadsheets we sort of have artwork as the high level everything, the the distinction, the sort of binary flag of is it art or not, rather than asking the art or not Twitter bot to make a call. So that I think we might require, because it's sort of a meta type or a flag. Whereas painting seems like it's in this ultra common form, and everything else seems, or similar thing, other non ultra common ones seem like they would be in the listed. But then these guys, the parts, seem like we can enumerate the common ones for, you know, front, back, top, bottom, side. You know, that's going to give a useful starting point. But then maybe panel or base or frame are not so common that we should be pushing them. But not optional. Yeah, and Nicola sort of said we should recommend these because we can enumerate the core and allow the rest to be extended. Sounds good. Right. So it is the top of the hour. We didn't get to next steps for the API, but we'll put that first on the agenda for next time. So thank you, everyone. Thanks to Richard and John for taking the notes. Thanks everyone for participating. And yeah, we'll have a call again in a couple of weeks. I will work on trying to apply that rubric to the vocabulary, and we'll see where we can go. Right. Thank you again. And
thank you. Bye bye.
Bye now.